Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Freedom Forum, and we've been discussing the Alberta experiment with Wallace Klinck from Canada. Welcome, Wallace.
Hi there, Arnie. It's good to be back with you in such a short time.
No
I think it was
worries.
about 5 minutes ago when we were zooming.
Good on you. Good on you for being party to it. Okay, so in the previous forum, what we were discussing was in summary, was the claim to the community's wealth. Does it actually belong to the community, or does it belong to banks? Now, let's just put that in perspective, because the banks, when they issue new loans, it's on the basis that people wish to purchase what is already there. So when the farmer produces a crop and the crop is there for the market, it actually has to be mortgaged. The people who want to purchase the crop have to mortgage it. They have to actually take out a loan in order to actually execute the purchase. And so we're actually borrowing in order to purchase what has already been produced. And this is part of the anomaly, that when we start to look at the financial system, we realize, hang on, this isn't straightforward. This is a can of worms. Wallace.
Yes, it certainly is a can of worms. We're being forced to mortgage from both ends, from the production end, which is appropriate, but also from the consumption end. Now, consumption is the end of the economic process. And all the physical costs have been provided, or inputs have been provided, and that is the physical costs have been provided. And when any item is finished, it has been paid for physically. We have a problem. We have what we call a moral imperative. It's a rule that we have set that everyone must earn their way. It's a suggestion that human beings produce everything, because if you have to pay for everything that you get in this life, it means that you're you're paying other people for things that they have produced. Well, as we know, that is an absurd situation, especially today, because technology has already largely displaced labor as a factor of production, and it is rapidly displacing it, uh, at an exponential rate, actually. So it's becoming more and more rapid, the displacement, as we move through time. And in other words, human beings do not produce all wealth. Well, if you're going to insist that human beings through their earned incomes must or can only access wealth through their earned incomes, well, then there's something wrong here, because that means that the human input is regarded as the whole input into production. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way in nature, and it does not work that way in our modern economy.
Mm,
Because, and if we're going to insist that human beings can only be moral if they pay for everything they get through their own labors, well, I don't know. I guess we can scrap all of the technology that we have developed and go back to the primitive economy and make darn good and sure that everybody is producing wealth, mostly by labor,
mm,
or we can use our intelligence and distribute the abundance, the profit, I think, as you've referred to it, that occurs through human association to the community as a whole. And it's important not only it's important for the consumers to have economic security, but it's absolutely essential for the producers too, because the producers have to have money derived from the consumer in order to recover their costs,
mm,
so that they can borrow again, resume production, and carry on their service to the community,
mm.
and make a reasonable profit for themselves, a living for themselves in doing that. So I mean, it's self-defeating to insist that everybody's got to be working in order to access production.
Mm.
That is ridiculous. If you go to an island, you're not going to set up some kind of a rule like that when you find all sorts of abundant fruit hanging from the tree. I
Mm,
think you're going to eat.
mm,
You're not going to run around trying to figure out how to give someone a job before you eat. You
mhm,
could starve in the meantime.
mhm.
I mean, this is insanity. And
Well,
it's simply, from a standpoint of even morality, it is wrong, because it is denying people what should be readily accessible to them in the nature of things according to natural law.
mm,
And so, even from a theological standpoint, it is completely wrong, because Well, from a Christian standpoint, salvation is not something that you climb the rungs of a ladder to earn. It's something that is just simply a gift that is given to you.
And
It is a gift.
this is to me is most important because we're talking about the people in Alberta. We're talking about everyone, but essentially it's actually the Alberta people in the early 1930s, in the midst of the Great Depression, were actually looking at these things. They were discussing these things, and they were attempting to implement policy. And they came up against all the powers that be, especially central banks and the administration. The administration being the bureaucrats and the politicians, the elites,
Mm-hmm.
the political class, who resisted the people of Alberta. So you had a social credit electorate, but you had an anti-social credit administration. And they came up against that administration and they attempted to implement policy, but their road was cut off at every turn. Was it Mackenzie? Is it Mackenzie King?
King, yes, our
And
prime minister.
they disallowed laws. They actually had the lieutenant governor interfere,
Mm-hmm.
and so the province itself was unable to actually execute policy that the electorate had placed the people into power to achieve. And I
Even,
find that
even
yeah, go on, Wallace. Yeah.
well, even though Mackenzie King had said hands off Alberta, but
Mhm.
I think he was just trying to appeal to a sector of the electorate.
Mhm.
I think for electoral purposes,
Mhm.
because he certainly didn't follow through with it. And he was a former Rockefeller employee.
Mhm.
As a matter of fact, he was the one I understand who assigned the Trotsky and his large band of revolutionaries to assign them passage through the port in eastern Canada, Halifax.
Wow. Wow. So that's a bit of history that people wouldn't be aware of, that the actual Canadian connection to the revolution in the Soviet Union. That's to me is most important, and
Well,
that's part of history, and that's there for you to find out in your own time. But the
mm,
point of it here is that the Prime Minister Mackenzie King and his cabinet were actively opposed to Alberta and the policy of social credit and the policy of actually balancing the costs so that the community could purchase what it actually produced. And
yes,
I
they did
think,
have
yeah,
some credit legislation that was proposed, but it was all found ultra vires by the federal courts, by the Privy Council
hmm
in Ottawa, and it was all completely
disallowed.
quashed.
hmm
Yeah, disallowed.
Mm.
Hmm.
Yeah,
And
so
so
mm,
I think Aberhart at one point, kind of private conversations I had with someone who knew him well, I think he said that if he were to do it over again, that he would go across the country and find young men who were inspired to do something about it and to carry on a campaign amongst the population
hmm
to generate, an uprising of demands
hmm
for this policy.
hmm
Because Abraham recognized the weaknesses of the party,
hmm
party politics, and
hmm
all of the obstacles that can be thrown in your way.
hmm
Abraham also had not earlier when he didn't really understand what to do with. You see, the province was terribly in debt, and he didn't know what to do about it, so he sought actually
further
assistance.
loans. Yeah.
Yeah, with a fellow called McGore from the East who represented the financial interests. And of course, that was upsetting to Douglas, who had tried to advise Eberhard along different lines, and Douglas was, you don't just run across the Atlantic Ocean every day in those days. It was
hmm
he wanted to have some assurance that Eberhard would attempt to follow his advice before he just was running back and forth. So
hmm
he did send Dennis Byrne and another gentleman over as advisors.
hmm
Now, you see, Dennis Byrne was really a very qualified person, and he was one of those who was targeted very quickly by the Manning administration. He was literally fired.
hmm
Now, I don't know if you know, but Laurier Lapierre, a Canadian
hmm
uh, commentator, just hosted a program on Eberhard of Alberta. It was produced in 1915. I mean, 2015. And it went through quite a long, detailed history of Eberhard in his early years and, his political involvement and all of that. And I think that you're left kind of with more or less with the impression that Eberhard was a bit of an amateur and a bit of a bungler.
Hmm.
But he did say at the end, he said, we'll have to give Eberhard credit. He really was interested in the well-being of the people of Alberta. We have to give him credit for that.
Hmm.
But you can see it's a way of damning with faint praise. You paint him as a bit of a bungler. It's all over now. But he had the right intentions.
Hmm.
But with regard to Douglas and the people and the two representatives that he sent over, he made the comment that some people thought Douglas was a fascist. He didn't say who these people were. Well, the fact of the matter is, in Britain, that Mausoley's fascist made a point of physically attacking social credit meetings
Hmm.
in the UK.
Hmm.
And Douglas had spoken out strongly against statist forms of government, including fascism, communism.
Hmm.
It was decentralization of power was absolutely at the core of his message.
Hmm.
And so, I mean, and then he mentioned these two individuals without naming them and called them Douglas's thugs. Now, you see, that's the type of propaganda that is used in such a dishonest and unethical manner. I happen to know Dennis Byrne very, very well. I
Hmm.
knew him for probably well over a decade,
Hmm.
and I thought he was a highly competent and honorable person.
Hmm.
Douglas Byrne retained his British citizenship and
Dennis
served
Byrne.
his country as the British Trade Commissioner until retirement in Alberta, and he was awarded an Order of the British Empire.
Hmm.
And this man says he was a thug,
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
see?
Hmm.
And that's the type of really devious and dishonest and
To
contemptible type of behavior that goes on.
to discredit someone before and not even give them an opportunity to speak, and
No, and he's
and
not
cert
living now. He's
and
not living now to defend himself either.
that's right, and certainly not to an opportunity for people to actually consider those proposals that are, and that to me why discussion debate is so vitally important. This forum is about discussion debate. If you've got a contrary point of view, I'd like to hear from you. If you're prepared to come on and discuss these things, I'd actually enjoy the opportunity to interview you and actually place your thoughts on the table. Because in order to, if you like, work these things through, there needs to be robust discussion. But that means
Hmm.
that you at least have the courtesy of allowing someone else another point of view. And so I'm prepared to do that, to give people equal time to discuss these things, to present their case, if it's a compelling case of from their point of view. So I think that to me is most important, Wallace, that we're actually looking at the history of what was actually going on, the subterfuge, the if you like, the masking of what was actually the efforts, even though the people of Alberta in their infancy, if you like, in their honesty, were just attempting to do something which they saw as a principle that they should be entitled to exercise. And the central government of Canada and the courts, Lieutenant Governor included, resisted the people to exercise that sovereign, in my view, sovereign right. And I find it fascinating that while social credit is being discredited, the fact is it was never actually implemented, and so it can't be justifiably discredited. Let it be implemented, and let people look and make up their own minds. If an equilibrium can be found between finance and economics, where people are able to purchase what they actually produce, that to me makes sense.
Well, the
Whereas
Bank
the
of England obviously was very opposed to social credit. Under no circumstances was it going to be supported.
Mhm.
And also, I understand that there was what's called a press ban. It went out more or less a message to all of the press saying, do not debate social credit.
Mhm.
If you have to refer to it, do it derisively,
Mhm.
but do not debate it.
Mhm.
Because when you start debating things, things start to emerge.
Mhm.
And that's very dangerous if you don't want those things to emerge. If you have a contrary policy, you don't want the other side's position to be exposed. Now you're talking about exposing everything. It should. Everyone should have a right to speak. But
Mm,
as you know, as we're moving into this particular age, censorship is becoming more and more
obvious.
overt.
Yeah.
It's very, very. It
Mm,
was covert for a long time and becoming more obvious because as as people learn things and the powers that be understand that they're learning them, they are put in a difficult position. They have to either ignore it at risk to themselves or they have to suppress it ultimately.
mhm,
And of course, the more you try and suppress things, sooner or later things backfire on you.
mm. That's
That's
exactly right.
the,
I
the,
think to me that's most important that I'm not big on Donald Trump, but the fact is he's making this call about false news and the false media and false this and false that. And to me it's quite he's hitting the nail on the head. The fact is that the what you call mainstream media, or I refer to as corporate media, only
mhm.
presents their point of view, and they have no intention of allowing other points of view. And this is why the internet is so powerful, because it allows people to present discussions, forums, alternative perspective on history, on events, on the actual dissemination of the news, and in this case, what was actually going on in Alberta in the 1930s. And I think it's actually most profound that we're looking at this community of three-quarters of a million people, a province, and it's not entitled to do the things that the electorate wishes it to do. And it's the federal government interference, the courts, the government interference is essentially a case that we won't entertain your sovereign right to do something, that you can actually
Yes,
balance the economy. So you've got to have an assumption then, and the assumption is that it is policy. It is government and bureaucratic policy to impose progressive debt onto the community to the point that they are entirely enslaved. And that, to me, is what we're saying here. That the Alberta experiment was stifled, it was cut off at every pass in order for them not to demonstrate that it is technically and physically and mathematically possible to have a balanced financial system, and that the progressive indebtedness of the world is actually policy of the central banks. And that to me is most profound. We've actually uncovering something here, Wallace, that the people of Alberta were instrumental in at least attempting to do something about it.
yes, they were, Arnie, and you know it expanded too into the federal realm. And there was a point where they had as many as 36 members of parliament on Ottawa. There were several from the West, and actually the leadership was divided between Dr. Robert Thompson, who had actually helped Haile Selassie in Ethiopia to set up his air force.
Hmm.
But anyway, Dr. Thompson taught out at, I think, Caribou College for the rest of his career. But, and then there was Riel Coet, who was really a very powerful speaker in Quebec. He was
Hmm.
quite a powerful speaker. And he came out of the Union of Electors, which was a non-party social credit group.
Hmm.
See, Douglas did not believe in promoting social credit through political parties.
Hmm.
And if you look at the behavior of political parties, I think it's pretty easy to understand why he was opposed to promoting it in that particular environment.
Hmm.
Because it's, in the first place, anything that gets into the political arena is going to be subject to competition and to well, there are going to be all sorts of mudslinging and distortions and so on and so forth. Truth simply cannot exist within political parties because they're vying for power and truth are at odds with each other in the realm of human association that way.
Hmm.
So, so there was not just in Alberta, but it did move, and there was a movement in other parts of the country too. But it did move into the federal parliament and was, significant. I think they held the balance of power, as a matter of fact, at one point. So it was something that was moving, but unfortunately, there seemed to be some kind of an invisible obstruction from the West. In the first place, Manning was not a Catholic, and Riel Coet, who led the Quebec contingent, was from that particular religious background. And there was hostility on that particular level, which interfered with the cooperation between the Eastern and the Western social creditors. And again, Manning said at a talk that he gave, one of this talk, he was given a script, and he referred, for instance, to Gibson's History of the Roman Empire. Well, it's not Gibson's, it's Gibbons. He was given a script. He was completely out of his depth. He didn't know what he was talking about, but somebody gave him a script to read. And at one point he got lost, and there's electricity in the air, as though he was frightened, as though he was really truly frightened of something. You could just feel the electricity. And so it was something prepared, and he was doing his duty as an agent of whoever. And it was just that way. And he said that nothing that man can do can solve the problems of this world until the return of Christ, our Lord and Redeemer. Well, Christ said, he was rather critical when he said, "You keep calling me Lord, Lord, but you don't do what I say."
That's right. There's so many parts in the words of Christ that talk about it. The virgins with the lamps, the denarius, all of those sorts of things are alluding to, or no, they're not. They're more than alluding. If you're lukewarm, I'll spit you out of my mouth. I mean, these things are all challenges
No,
to the
yeah.
Christians to actually bring about the Lord's Prayer. Thy kingdom come on earth.
Yeah,
The
on earth,
Lord's the
not some
Lord's That's right. The Lord's Prayer.
abstract.
Teach us how to pray. If you're going to pray, pray this. The Lord's Prayer. It's the most profound, anchored prayer coming out of if you like, the words of God Himself, Christ.
Well,
If you're
Douglas said
going
that
to
both
pray, yeah.
he said both social credit and Christianity have never been tried. And
Hmm,
he said the powers of this world, the financial powers of this world, mammon, if you want to call it, are absolutely determined that they will never be tried.
hmm, hmm,
And I think that the state of the world pretty well indicates that as being quite obvious, self-obvious.
hmm, hmm,
And anyway, the thing of it is about social credit. Social credit refers to the ability to do things, to achieve things, to accomplish things.
hmm,
In other words, we appeal to the creativity within the human mind, soul, being, to liberate that, to make it so that it can be a living force in the world
hmm,
and in our lives. But Mr. Manning said, no, nothing anyone can do
hmm,
will do any good. There's nothing anyone can do. Well, that should certainly fit right into the policy of the financial powers who want to keep people ignorant of what is actually being done.
hmm, hmm.
So
Yeah, it's
he wasn't one of my favorite politicians, I can assure you.
no.
And one of his chief lieutenants told me that social credit was too good for the people.
Hmm,
The implication being that people are sinners and that they are not capable of living within a moral dispensation without the return of Christ.
hmm,
Well, it seemed to me he came 2,000 years ago with some pretty good advice,
hmm.
and we might take some of it seriously.
That's exactly right. Do we take our Christian faith seriously enough to bring about God's kingdom on earth? And that's to me
Mm-hmm.
is what the people in Alberta in the mid 1930s attempted to do. And yes, they were up against formidable powers, but the fact is that they, in their innocence, in their confidence, even in their
Mm-hmm.
ignorance, if you like, they may not have known better, but they still had a go, and they planted the seeds of which history will look back and say, well, they had a go. Yes, they had all the powers of the world against them, but they had a go. And the fact is that it's up to us as we are Christians today to actually have a go, to put our trust and hope and faith into works, to actually outwork, to bring about God's kingdom on earth. That's
If
what
we see
this.
merit, and if we see merit in this thing, it's our moral obligation, surely, to try
Hmm,
and resurrect it and to promote it and to advance it
hmm,
for the benefit of all our fellows. I mean, if people were made in the image of God, we should be divine beings that are deserving of respect and living within an abundant world, surely.
That's exactly right. That's an interesting point you bring up, Wallace, and that is the metaphysical. We are divine beings. We're just not flesh and blood. But there's a spirit inside of us, and that spirit inside of us has come from the very presence of God. And if you can't see that in your fellow creature, your fellow man, then you're missing the most important part of this world that we live in. Mm,
Yeah, and to assume that everybody else is wrong, that they're evil, and that they're prone to sin at every turn of the road is not a very charitable attitude toward your fellow man. And I think it is quite unchristian, actually.
hmm
I think it is very unchristian.
mm,
I don't think we're not supposed to be quick to judge other people. He who is guilty, let him throw the first stone.
that's
I
right.
mean, that is humility. Whereas the the socialist or the statist approach to life assumes that the state is the final arbiter of what is right and wrong.
Mm,
And surely to goodness, it's only realistic to assume that what is right and wrong has to conform with the fundamental nature of the universe, with natural law itself,
mm, mm. Yeah, that's
not
beautiful.
with, not with somebody's edict.
That's exactly right, Wallace, because the fact is the outworking of the state is only ever other people. And so
Yes.
what would place them in a position of such profound virtue that they would actually know what is better for you than what you do yourself? And of course,
Well,
it's humbug, and it really comes back to, if you like, the Luciferian sin, the sin of
mhm.
pride, that I know better than God Himself. And of course,
Exactly. And
that's not the case at all. No,
well, it would be pretty hard to prove, wouldn't
it certainly
it?
would. It certainly
You need
would.
a lot of evidence.
It
And
certainly would.
furthermore, and we've seen where that's what states where the government assumes an abnormal amount of power, a power that goes beyond functionality.
That's right. That's right.
It
Yeah.
it then begins to become oppressive
hmm
and dangerous.
And
And
that's what we're witnessing. That's what we're actually witnessing today. To me,
mhm.
most important, I think we've covered some exceptional ground in these last two forums, Wallace. And I'm looking at the clock, believe it or not, because it's blitzing away.
But
And
Arnie, you keep cutting me off all the time.
only, only because in amongst it, Wallace, I have these thoughts, and I think I've got to get them out. If I don't get them out, they'll disappear, and I'll they won't be actually tabled, and that's what that's about. Hey, Wallace, I'm happy for you to be here for all and every day. We can keep going on this, but
Well, sometimes I'm in bed and I get an idea and I think, wow, why didn't I think of that when I was out of bed in the
that's right.
daytime?
Yeah.
And I'm terrified that I'm going to forget the idea that I've
Mm,
just had.
that's right.
And I rarely get up and write it down, but I
Mm,
try to remember it. But at my
mm.
age, my memory isn't perfect either. So.
Well, I'm actually just for the viewers' information. I run a diary, and I do place my thoughts in it. And the reason for this
Mm,
forum is because the thoughts come to me. They come to me. They don't originate in me. They come to me. They are actually a gift. And don't tell me that that same gift isn't there for you. Those
I feel
thoughts
that way. Yes,
that
I agree with you.
those thoughts coming to you, that to me is the Holy Spirit inside of you, around you, emanating from God.
I hope
These are the
so.
constant revelations that you have, that you hadn't thought of something, and the fact is you can't restrict the power of God. That's what this is all about. These people
Right.
at Alberta had a go. They put their faith into works based on that God is alive, is real, and is talking to them every minute of every day.
And believe me, many of them really sacrificed a lot, men and women.
hmm
They sacrificed a great deal for the cause. Too
Beautiful.
bad they were betrayed, but they really put everything into it. Many
Mm,
of them really put their whole
mm,
lives into it.
Well, the thing is that they're not forgotten, Wallace, and the fact is that
Right.
we've got the documents here um, on our websites, the Veritas books, the Alberta Experiment, on the Social Creditor, the
hmm
archives that are there in the Australian League of Rights Library. Thanks to some good work of some loyal Canadians who did that, and also the New Times and the On Targets. These are archives that go back almost 90 years, certainly to the 1930s, and I think it's most opportunistic. It's certainly timely that we reconsider these things that have been lost, but should never have been forgotten. Yeah, no worries. I really appreciate what you're doing, Wallace, and I thank you for your time again today. We've covered some good ground, and hopefully we'll catch up again soon.
Well, thank you, Arnie. I really appreciate being with you, and you have delayed my supper a little bit, but that's okay.
Good on you, bud, in your minus 20 degrees. Good luck. Don't put it outside, it'll be rock hard. No
Right.
worries. This is Arnie Luks at the Freedom Forum, wishing you well, and hopefully we'll catch up again soon.